Good evening, everybody, and welcome to a very special interview and author event with Dorothy Ellen Palmer, all the way from Canada. And the subject this evening is going to be Wiggins, son of Sherlock. We're going to have a very quick intro to MX Publishing and Orange Pip Books from myself, Steve Emmets. I'm the founder and the managing director of MX Publishing. And then we're going to have a quick reading and author Q&A with Dorothy over there in Canada. So quick background on MX. We were founded in 2006, so we're 15 years old, and we're the largest Sherlock Holmes publisher in the world, pretty much by whichever way you want to measure it. We have over 150 authors writing for us, and we have over 500 titles out. We've sold over 2 million books in various formats, whether it be print and ebooks. We have lots and lots of audio books now, and we've even done some Sherlock Holmes art as well. It's important to note that we are a social enterprise. We support 3 main causes. There are a number of other causes that we work with, and they're all on our website if you want to take a look. I'm going to mention 3 of them and just take you through those 3 tonight. The first one is Stepping Stone School in the UK, Happy Life Children's Home in Kenya, where Sharon and I will be visiting again in a few weeks' time. So we'll be flying out to Nairobi in the middle of December to see the children. And we also work with the United Nations World Food Programme. So Stepping Stone School, which is just being renamed as Undershore, back to its original name, is a school for children with learning disabilities. And we've been working with them since 2009. And I was named a patron of the school in 2016. We've raised nearly $100,000 now for the school through various events and awareness, and through the MX book, which we'll talk about in a moment. The school is based at Sir Arthur Conan Doyle's former home. He wrote Hound of the Baskervilles there and many other of the Sherlock Holmes stories. And if you look at the picture there, you'll see the beautiful old building restored back to its former glory. And on the right-hand side there, the new part of the school with state-of-the-art hydrotherapy and music therapy and some fantastic classrooms, etc., for the children. Happy Life Children's Home is very close to Sharon and I's heart. You can see a picture of Sharon there with the kids. We've been working with them since 2012, and we're mentors. We usually spend Christmas at Happy Life. We missed it last Christmas, first time in 8 years due to the pandemic, but we're back out there now in December. We started really as volunteers, baby feeding and playing with the kids and things like that. But increasingly, we've been working on some bigger projects. Interestingly, 4 years ago, we actually video enabled the Happy Life locations because they were really struggling with the travel between the main location and the out of town location. And we were very kindly sponsored by a small little company at the time called Zoom, which everybody knows now has become a worldwide phenomenon. So they still sponsor us today. In 2020, my wife came up with the amazing idea of books to trees. So we've always been very environmentally friendly as a publisher. We were the first publisher in the world way back in 2001 to be completely digital. So all of our books are produced completely print on demand. And last year we actually became carbon positive by running this program in Nairobi. So we funded 1,000 trees so that they could have lots and lots of trees at the out of town location for Happy Life. And in 2021, we've switched our focus with the building of their new high school to the Books to Books campaign. And we're aiming to fund 2,000 books for the school kids out there in Kenya. We also work with the United Nations World Food Programme. It's an incredible organisation. It's the world's largest NGO with a budget in the many billions. And we've been working with them since 2017. I'm a technology mentor, and I work with them with their innovation programme and doing one-to-one projects with them. We were absolutely proud to be awarded the Nobel Peace Prize last year. So it was an incredible experience to play a small role in such an incredible organisation. On to books. So the largest project we have is the MX Book of New Sherlock Holmes Stories. It was launched in 2015, and it now has an incredible 30 volumes. We actually started with the plan of doing one volume of about 25 stories, 26 stories, and it ended up just growing and growing and growing. Over 150 authors have taken part, many MX authors, but also some really, really big names. So Lee Child, Jonathan Kellerman, Nicholas Meyer, Bonnie McBird, Lindsay Fay and Kareem Abdul-Jabbar, just some of the big names that have taken part. There's over 700 stories now, and 10,000 pages. And I think you need a bookshelf about 2 meters long now to display all of the books in the series. And we're just launching this month volumes 28, 29, and 30. And at the rate that it's growing, we still are creating 4 to 6 new volumes every year. It holds loads of world records, the most amount of stories, the most amount of authors participating, the most amount of reviews for a series from Publishers Weekly as well. We also work with a fascinating project in America called Dear Holmes. So this was launched in 2018, and it's a subscription service where if you want to be a detective, you can actually follow in the steps of Sherlock Holmes, and you get a letter every week for during the month, and you try and solve the case. And it's a hugely fun project to be involved with, and this is now our 3rd year doing it. So I think we're up to case number 33 or something like that in the series. We've also got involved in the world of art. This is a wonderful project created and curated by a Sherlock Holmes author called Phil Growick, based out of West Palm Beach in America. We started with 1 book, and it's ended up being 4 books. Each book has the stories and a piece of art created from and inspired by that story. So 56 short stories, just like Sir Arthur, and each one has had a piece of art created for it. The first 2 books, we had gallery launches in America, and then the pandemic arrived and we weren't able to do any more. But you can actually click the link on the slides or go to our website, and you can actually walk around a gallery. So we've built a virtual gallery with all of the pieces of art in it, so you can go and have a look. And if you've got deep pockets, you can maybe even buy one of the original pieces of art. But there's prints available which are endorsed by the Conan Doyle estate. So on to Orange Pip. So Orange Pip Books was launched in 2019 as a new Sherlock Holmes brand. There really was a need, and it was pioneered by a lovely lady called Nico, who's on the line tonight, so we can ask her some questions when we get to the Q&A. There really was a need for a new imprint or a new brand to cater for more inclusive Sherlock Holmes projects. So because Sir Arthur Conan Doyle wrote in the time period that he wrote, there are a lot of areas that are not tackled in the Sherlock Holmes stories, and there's lots of types of characters that just don't have a representation within the original canon. So Orange Pip supports lots of LGBTQ+ and BAME characters, and tackles a number of subjects that Sir Arthur didn't cover in the original stories. So we've had some fascinating books in the first 3 years of Orange Pip, and we're going to be talking to the author of one of those this evening. So on to Wiggins, son of Sherlock. So Dorothy Ellen Palmer, I'm not proposing to do too much of an introduction here, because I think we'll go straight to Dorothy herself. But this is the premise for Wiggins, son of Sherlock. The central character, Wiggins, is an absolutely fascinating character, and I can't wait to get into the Q&A. But I think what we'll do is I'll stop my screen share and get Dorothy on the screen. Hi, Dorothy.
Hello.
I see you're there in what is your lounge, is it?
Yes.
And I spy some candles in the background. I always like to look at the first few moments, just look around the room. There's a couple of pieces of art on the wall there behind you as well. And there's a statue which looks like some sort of gazelle or deer.
Close. It's an antelope that came from Africa when I went on a ship's school when I was 14.
Oh, fantastic. Yeah, I went straight to that because as we were chatting about before we did the recording, Sharon and I have been out to Kenya many times. We've traveled all over Africa to many different countries. So that my eye was drawn to that straight away. I don't see a bookshelf. Is the bookshelves somewhere?
They're all around the rest of the apartment, just
Yeah.
not in the view at the moment.
And how many do you have? A lot of Sherlockian books in that?
I've lost count. Yes, let's just say yes.
Fantastic. And are you up for doing a little reading for us?
Sure. I'll introduce myself briefly. My name is Dorothy Ellen Palmer. I'm a disabled senior writer here in Canada. This will be my fourth book. It'll be, oddly enough, the book I've been longing to write the longest and probably writing the longest. I've always wanted to write a Sherlock Holmes book since I was 9 years old and fell in love with Sherlock. So this is very much a dream come true for me. The bit I'm going to read to you from is the introduction, and I'm going to read the very opening scene and then skip a bit and go to the end of the first chapter so you can see the setup of the dilemma in which Wiggins finds themselves. It was the coldest morning of my young life. It was the winter of my 15th year. Inspired and abetted by the wily London snowstorm that so fittingly shrouded the debut of 1891, the great detective who was my father summoned me to breakfast with New Year's first sun, where, before so much as a single bite of crumpet, he decreed my death at dawn. How are you? You have been lying in a Whitechapel gutter, I perceive. His first words were not a question, but an affirmation of instructions. I nodded and wished him a most deductive New Year, a phrasing I had crafted with considerable cogitation, hoping to please him. Instead, he snorted. Exposure can be deadly, Wiggins. Disrobe immediately. Breakfast nudity? Now that was an odd request, even for my father. While we often dined in costume, all previous performances before an attentive audience of toast points had included pants. But that morning, ignoring both the irony of his request and the dismay it caused me, he bolted from his chair to capture my beloved cap. None observed your arrival, Wiggins, neither your person nor your footprints? I nodded. You journeyed to Baker Street circuitously, walking backwards in the snow? I nodded again. Having adhered to my methods, you can swear you were not followed. I could. You have put it about that you were unwell, suffering from cough and from fever. I had. You have coughed convincingly in public places. I do not wish to know if you spit. From here we see that Sherlock is disrobing Wiggins in order to re-robe a dead boy and to leave the dead boy in his place, because they are plotting their great disappearance, otherwise known as the Great Hiatus in Sherlockian circles. And of course, most people don't know where they went. I know exactly where they went. They went to Canada, as we'll find out in a moment. Wiggins is told by Sherlock that not only does he have to go to Canada in order to safeguard him, in order to keep him safe, he must travel incognito as a girl. Then Sherlock disappears, leaving Wiggins alone on the steps to ponder his or her fate. When I realized father had not taken my boots, it curdled my heart. Of course not. No one but my lovely mother could bring themselves to touch my feet. In full red-headed temper, I damned Holmes to hell for all of Baker Street to hear. Hurling every street slur the irregulars ever taught me, I eviscerated the third commandment. I blasphemed the Heavenly Father for giving me a parent who would exile me to a snowy land of backwoods and beavers. I swore into the face of a most alarmed pedestrian, a costermonger with a cart full of spotty oranges, that under no circumstances would I become his conspiratorial Canadian icicle. I slammed the door. Perfectly timed 3 beats later, it cracked back open. You may keep your cap, Wiggins. I have, of course, made a copy. Insulted by my father's retreating back, how I longed for definitive data. Left shivering on that icy threshold, dreading the pain of remounting his bloody 17 steps, I could not untangle deduction from deceit. Had Holmes improvised Miss Euphemia Hortensia McLean for me as a punishment? To mock me? To cripple this little cripple with the most execrable name in history? Or was it an invention to a kind cross-dressing? Had he used my methods and asked me to pose as a girl to expose my secret desire that I craved the swish of skirts to cover my feet? I had no logical answers to these most vital questions. Did Holmes know I was his child? Did he know me for a girl? Thank you.
Fantastic. It's a really, really interesting premise. And I love the way you set it up right at the beginning of the book. You dive straight in there. For those listening, you've got 2 different ways that you can submit questions. Some people put them into the chat window, but there is a question and answer window as well. So for everybody around the world, if you'd like to pop a question in the Q&A window or into the chat, that would be great. There's some nice messages coming in the chat window at the moment. Thank you for the reading, Dorothy. So that's wonderful. I'm going to kick off with a question from me, if that's okay. Your activism is an important part of your writing, and how do you find getting the balance between the narrative and the informative part? Is that a tough thing to do, or does it come naturally?
Yeah, I think it's a very tough thing to do. And I know that I sometimes go overboard and get a little didactic and a little preachy. And some of that comes from my characters. Some of that comes from being a teacher for 30 years, where you're expected to sort of tell people what something means. But I think the saving grace is I know Wiggins, I hear her, I feel her. And as long as I let her authentically do the speaking, then I think it saves me from being the 21st century activist, and being a 19th century 14-year-old girl.
And do you think there's room for, I mean, it's a very leading question. Do you think there's room for more inclusive characters in Sherlock Holmes stories? Because of course, in the preamble, I talked about the fact that Conan Doyle was writing in his era, and in his era, literature didn't talk about certain things.
Yes, I like that part of your intro very much, and I think it's not only that there's room. I think it's critical that we make room, and if necessary, force ourselves in and make room. ACD wasn't just writing in an era. He was a white British man, with the wealth of in the history of the empire behind him. And of course, a lot of his racialized characters are stereotypical today. And of course, he leaves out so many people, and the way he writes about women is often questionable, with the exception of Irene Adler, who was always one of my heroes, and is, of course, Wiggins' mother in the book. And I think what I also think is outside of the book, in the world of Sherlockiana, in the world of Sherlock Holmes, white men have owned it for way too long and set up very exclusive societies where their view of Sherlock is seen as the only view of Sherlock. And of course, that isn't the only view of Sherlock. I have a lot of respect for, the Baker Street Irregular groups. I was a member of a science society, the Bootmakers of Toronto, for some years. And I think those people who respect and study the canon are wonderful, but I don't think they own anything. I think Sherlock belongs to everyone.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. I think we've not always been viewed by the traditionalists at MX here as doing everything right, because we've just opened it up so much. I find it hard to believe sometimes that we're just 13 13 years into our Sherlockian journey. Our first Sherlock Holmes book was published in 2008, and we're suddenly here with 500 books. And we've had Holmes with crossovers, we've had fantasy, we've had just published now Holmes and Watson, who are both women in disguise as men, and they're a couple. So there are lots of different variations of the theme. We also published, I think, going back quite a long time ago, actually, Samuel J. Williams, the first African American writer of pastiche, to our knowledge. But of course, Kareem Abdul-Jabbar has brought it to a whole another level as a famous basketball player as well. You mentioned Irene Adler there. It was interesting that you picked on her because she only appeared in a couple of the stories, just a few of the stories. Yet, if you look at the adaptations, she features very strongly BBC Sherlock, Robert Downey Jr. movies, and she's a natural, strong female character to come out of the canon. Do you see the role of women evolving in the coming years?
Yes, I think that a lot of writers, even certainly some that you've published, have written female adjuncts to Sherlock who are either relatives of Sherlock Holmes. I think of, in Canada, Angela Misery's excellent series with the relative of Sherlock Holmes being a young woman detective, that lend itself to uniting both some of the sort of traditional Sherlockian skills of deduction with perhaps a more social justice approach that might be more common to women, or perhaps one more based in community or based in family. There's all kinds of ways that a perspective that is different than the traditional white male Victorian perspective can be brought out and brought to bear by a woman main character in any kind of Sherlockian world.
One of our MX authors who writes very traditional pastiches, but with a focus on some interesting causes, is Gretchen Alterbach, and she writes about the suffragette movement quite strongly. So, what advice would you give to new writers? A lot of the people that dial in and will watch this will be aspiring writers. What would you have told yourself 30 years ago? What advice would you have given yourself when you got started?
Yeah, I think I got the best advice I've ever gotten, will be almost 30 years ago now, when I was first at Banff, which is a writer's colony here in Canada. And a poet named Dale Zeroth said to me, write the book that no one else but you can write. And that has uplifted me and held me up a lot, because there are times where you're writing and you're thinking, oh, that's crap, that's awful, no one will ever want to read that, I'm terrible. And you go through all through those kinds of insecurities. And then what reminds you that it might be worth doing is that it's a book that no one else but you can write. You bring to it something of your identity and your experience and the way you've grown and changed and been hurt and loved and gone through both of those things and survived. And if you bring that somehow to a book, I think that's the best advice I could give, because then it keeps it from just being another one of those books out there. There's something about the voice and something about the content that makes it authentic and desirable.
What was the hardest character for you to write in this book? Who did you struggle with the most?
Yeah, I can get to that. There are sort of two and they're intertwined. As you can see, I'm wearing my McLean tartan. Very late in life, when the legislation changed in Canada, as an adoptee, I discovered that my birth mother was a McLean. And I discovered that her family farm was literally miles from London, Ontario, where I went to university, where I was studying 19th century social history, oddly enough. And what I wanted to do with this book was to fulfill a fantasy of being related to Sherlock and being related to Irene. So I put them on the McLean farm in Canada. And one of the villains, the worst villain in the book, is Irene's father. Irene's father, and we find, well, I won't give you that bit away. I was just going to say Irene's father is definitely the villain. He is a pedophile. He is someone who has harmed a number of people in Irene's life, including Sherlock, and including the other person who grew up on the McLean farm, who was actually related to Irene, was her cousin, who was Mycroft. So these two farms sit side by side. Irene and Mycroft are cousins, and Holmes is a swept off the street Holmes boy, brought to work as a servant in Mycroft's family home. So there's this kind of love triangle that develops between Holmes and Irene and Mycroft, but her father, who is one of the worst human beings in the world, spoils all of that. And he was the most difficult character to write because I was making one of my own family ancestors a really nasty person. But I also wanted to normalize the idea that home children were not necessarily treated well when they were brought from Britain to Canada. And I think that's, we don't talk enough about the children and the disabled children that existed obviously in Sherlock's world. And this was one of the ways to bring them into that world.
I think the technique you're talking about, I usually refer to it as method writing. So there's method acting where you immerse yourself kind of in the character to play the role. But I wrote 2 novels many years ago, more than 20 years ago, fortunately out of print because they were very bad. But I would method write. I would actually physically have to be in the place I was writing about. So I actually travelled into the outback of Australia, and I travelled into Cuba for the two different novels. And I think that piece of immersing yourself in that. Do you have any specific writing techniques that get you into that? Is it a particular room that you sit in? Is it a particular brand of whiskey that you drink? You hear these different writers, but I can only get the flow going with a bottle of Maclellan or whatever it is.
Unfortunately not. I'm actually really always very embarrassed when someone asks me this question, because I was an English/drama teacher for decades and taught kids every kind of story and creative writing starter you could think of, from graphs and T-squares and word webs and, every kind of prompt that you could think of to start writing. And I use none of them ever. I don't even outline. I sit down at the computer, I read the last sentence, and I try to hear it in my head, and I keep going. And I have a little notepad beside me where I might jot 2 or 3 words, which always means something to me at the time, and I may not understand what they mean when I look at them again, but they often take me somewhere new in the story because I've thought of something that Wiggins would have said or done or been angry about. But I also view any kind of organization of writing as completely valid. Any way that you approach it. Some people organize to the nth degree, and that's great. Some people like me don't organize at all, and that's great too. Try whatever works for you.
It's interesting you mentioned that you feel a bit guilty about that. We had on the Sherlockian panels, we did 2 panels with 6 authors on each last month. Really fascinating discussions, and I think it was David Markham, who's the most prolific Sherlock Holmes writer in the world. He's just posted up that I think he's just written his 89th pastiche, and of course he's edited the MX books. So he's edited over 700. So I think he's got probably the 2 world records for the most pastiches written and edited. But he said the same thing. He said, I feel guilty about the fact that I sit down with a blank sheet of paper and I hear Watson's voice, and it just floods out of me. Whereas, some of the other guys on the panel were, I have to spend all day planning it, and I have to write notes and post-it notes all over the screen and things like that. Lots of planning. Pam has put a lovely comment in. Dorothy, I wish you would have been my teacher. into the chat window. So that's a lovely comment. Thank you very much. So just a quick reminder, guys, you can put questions into the Q&A window or into the chat window, and we can ask those from Dorothy. I'm probably going to take the very, very dangerous step of suggesting that Nico comes back off of mute. So Nico's our lovely commissioning editor for Orange Pip, and
How rude.
based in Wales. Hey, Nico.
Hello.
So
Hello.
it's all Welsh tonight. Lots and lots of Welsh. That's lots and lots of Welsh. Have you got any questions for Dorothy, Nico?
So I'm kind of the same. We're almost Dorothy and I are almost time twins because we seem to have the same path, but both lecturing, both disabled activists. So I would now, we talked about structure, you talked about bringing your activists in. Do you think that when you're writing these kinds of stories, and I have a lot of students that want to now write more issue-based and issue-focused narratives, how important to get to the point where the narrative helps inform the issue rather than the issue informs the narrative? Any tips on how to sort of stop it from bubbling over into that preachy, exposition-y, and into enjoyable story kind of narratives?
Yeah, I don't know if I'm going to be much help to you there, because I sort of think two things. I think the way it comes out the first time is perfect no matter how it comes out, and you can always change it later. So I would never try to say, don't write a certain way in your first draft. Let it come out however you want. And I also think that publishing in general needs to be pushed a little more towards issue-oriented narrative, period. Because you can't say that you want to include diverse voices if you aren't going to listen to what we have to say. You can't say you're interested in diverse voices and then expect us to write like young, abled white people, men. So the things that are on our minds and the things that are important to us are often very different. And I think that's a good thing. And I think that content needs to be validated and respected and uplifted, and not necessarily tweaked back. Now, having said that, if there is no story and it's just a speech, then you should encourage them to go work for an NGO rather than be a writer, because because they're more interested in those ideas than they are in the structuring of story. And that may be a very valid thing for them to find out. You're right that there's got to be some kind of balance. I think that sometimes comes in the latter stages, not necessarily in the drafting.
It's also difficult, do you think, as a sort of writer trying to get more inclusive characters into things, hitting that barrier where sometimes you're just accused of tokenism when what you're trying to do is push forward characters, and it seems that no matter how much you push for something, someone's always pushing back to say that you're already doing it. Oh, it's an exercise in diversity, demographics, and blah blah blah. So do you find that as frustrating as I do?
Very much frustrating. And I give them a lesson in basic elementary math. I say 23% of the population is disabled. This means that 1 out of every 4 characters in every book on the planet should be disabled. Once you have more than 1 out of every 4 characters in your book being disabled, then maybe you're pushing a demographic. Until you have 1 out of every 4 that is disabled, you are still underrepresenting disabled people. In other words, shut up. Because it isn't overrepresenting or tokenizing to finally have a disabled character in a novel. Of course, there should be disabled characters in every novel.
We seem to be, and it does seem to be sometimes that disabled characters are the last ones to get a voice. I think we're still trying to get sort of into things and tell people, and it's actually normal. Quite a lot of people, characters are disabled. There's quite a lot of people in the world that have these problems. Do you see it getting better anytime soon?
I see it getting better in a very uneven and combined way.
Yeah.
I think the pandemic all of a sudden opened a lot of people's eyes to what inaccessibility really looks like, when no,
Yeah.
you can't get into a building. And so there was a certain sensitivity raised there. In Canada, I'm seeing far too many people rush right back to inaccessible buildings and inaccessible literary events as if it was their right all along, and forgetting what that inaccessibility was like. But I am seeing certain organizations and certain writers saying, hold on just a minute, we also now have to think about, if we're not going to go back to normal, one of
Yeah.
the things that was normal was inaccessibility. How do we change that? So I think that I am seeing some changes, but it's also taught me how deeply rooted ableism is in literature, in the arts world, that too many abled writers simply don't want to give up the privilege. Because if you think about it, if 75% of writers in the world who are abled, and the 23.5% of would-be writers who are disabled have been erased, so that the 75% get all the funding, all the space, all the recognition, all of the nachas, as we would say. They get everything, and they don't want to give up that privilege. So when they see a disabled writer saying, just a minute, there are no disabled writers on this panel, they say, well, I don't want to give up my space. So it's a very, confronting ableism. It has to work on all three levels. It has to work on an institutional level. It has to work on an organizational, arts organizational level, and it has to work on personal level, where individual authors have to recognize, hey, just a minute, no, I'm not going to be on a panel where it's all abled authors. I'm not. I'm just going to say to the organizer, we need to reorganize this panel and encourage the reorganization of it to be more inclusive. And I think, yes, we're seeing some people start to do all those things, but it's really slow. And it unfortunately often only happens when someone has been personally affected by being disabled themselves.
I think that's why I like what we do, in that I like the fact of going and putting a disabled character into an already existing world, so people can sort of get on board more quickly, if you know what I mean. So they can, well, I understand the word of Sherlock, I understand the characters of Sherlock. Oh, here's something different. Do you think that maybe putting sort of different characters, more diverse characters, into this already existing world makes them more accepted to new writers?
I hope so. I think that's a really good point. I certainly know that's what happened to me when I started to see women in the world of Sherlock. So logically, it makes perfect sense to me that, the more disabled characters in the world of Sherlock, the more disabled readers will see themselves there. I also think we need to see multiply marginalized people in the world of Sherlock. So people who are both racialized and disabled, or have any number of different multiple marginalizations, because that's something, of course, that ACD did not do well.
Well, and I'll give it back to Steve in a second. I promise, Steve. No, last point is that when this book came out, there was a lot of stuff on our Twitter page, on my Twitter page, and MX, from disabled readers going, "Oh, hooray! Oh, I get the best of both worlds. I get representation, and I get Sherlock Holmes." So I think that's really important, that we sort of keep on going for stuff like that. And I think it's good to encourage younger writers or older writers or any writers to think about, yes, this is the world of Sherlock Holmes, but surely there is room for everybody here, and everybody can have a voice, and everybody can share the joy of it. Like you said, Sherlock belongs to everybody, and so everybody should get a chance to read and write it.
Yeah, and I agree completely. And I think particularly in the Victorian world, Sherlock Holmes comes from a very class-based system, and the irregulars are somebody that were always near and dear to my heart because they didn't appear to have parents. I related to that as an adoptee. And the more we can include the, children, the hundreds of thousands of street children who, were victims of poverty and disability through working in places they shouldn't have been working, or in the street that didn't look out for them and were injured some way in the street. All of that was a part of the world of Sherlock that I think makes it way more inclusive to people who are disabled now.
Okay, you can come back now, Steve.
Thank you. It's lovely to chat with you.
You
No,
too, Dorothy.
yeah, thanks, Nico. Claudia's comment, I think, is a wonderful one in the chat, which is that this is a very amazing and necessary conversation that needs to be had, and maybe we can look to do a deeper dive on another session if you're up for it, both of you, and maybe get some more panelists in to talk about it.
Great idea.
I think there's one thing I wanted to pick up on that you mentioned there, which was about, you know, the first draft that you write, just write it and just do it, because the first one, you might have to go back and change it. There was one of our writers, Wendy Fries, she used to talk about just write, you know, and one of the things that's interesting about the Sherlock Holmes world that I don't see in too many others, maybe in the Whovian world as well a bit, is that there's a massive fan fiction and there's loads of fan lit online. So even if you're not writing to the standard or in the structure of to be published, sort of traditionally published in sort of paper and ebook and audiobook form, there's loads of vehicles out there to write. So if you want to write about whatever subject and bring whatever subject into the Sherlock Holmes world, you can absolutely do it in that kind of fan fiction kind of world. And some of that will then transition over. Jerry Shear is also another one of our female writers, and she talks about it in the same way. Just write, you know, get up and make sure you do 2,000, 3,000 words a day. You know, make sure you do it, whether it's an article, whether it's a short story, whether it's a bit for your novel. Just make sure you get it done and get some writing done every day.
I wouldn't go quite that far, to be honest with you. A lot of disabled writers have been very critical of the advice to write every day, because there are many days for us for which pain or incapacity makes that impossible. And so we don't want to be held to that somewhat ableist standard of being told to write every day. But I think what is really valuable in what you're saying is that the first draft is always perfect. It's a quote that I can't remember to attribute it properly, but a woman writer wrote, "The first draft is always perfect because it has no other reason except to exist." That's its only criteria. If it exists, it's perfect. And if you let yourself off the hook about a first draft being great or great writing, or, you know, wonderful off the bat, if you just drop that idea and just write as close to every day as you can manage, I think that that's a much healthier way to approach it, and probably in the long run produces better work too.
Yeah, I guess rephrasing to say write as often as you feel comfortable is the right way to do that.
Good point.
So a couple of questions that have come through on the Q&A. What's your personal favorite Sherlock story?
Scandal.
Scandal. Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay. And who is your favorite actor or actor?
In the world?
No, as Holmes.
Oh, Jeremy Brett, first and foremost. I was a teenager, late teenager, I guess, when I first started watching Jeremy Brett. And yeah, he to me is very much an incarnation of a lot of Sherlock. A little too shy, a little too geeky, but he's still my favorite.
We've had two kind of massive projects involving Jeremy in the last 2 years, I guess. The wonderful book from Maureen Whitaker, Jeremy Brett Playing a Part. It's one of the largest physical books we've ever done. Nearly 500 pages of foolscap. It's huge. I think it weighs about 3 kilos. And it's everything he's ever done on stage and screen, including 200 pages on Sherlock. And we actually had to re-release that section as a separate book because we got so many Sherlock fans that wanted just that. Can we just have that chapter, please? The 200 pages. So we re-released it as Jeremy Brett is Sherlock Holmes. But the other fascinating one is, I'm not sure if you had a chance to see him, but Jonathan Goodwin is an incredible actor who does. He did a tribute earlier this year to Jeremy, and performed that tribute as Jeremy Brett, talking about being Sherlock Holmes.
Lindsay Fay has a saying that I like a lot, that everyone's own Sherlock is their own Sherlock. And I think that's really true, that my kids love Sherlock Hemlock on the Muppets. I, really, really liked various forms of Sherlock growing up, and a lot of young people were reintroduced to Sherlock through Benedict Cumberbatch, and I think that's fine. I think any interpretation of Sherlock invites more people in.
Yeah, I think there are a few adaptations which wouldn't be that anybody's favorite Sherlock. Obviously, you mentioned Cumberbatch and Brett. Funnily enough, John Lee Miller is very popular when we do these Q&A sessions, but I haven't found anybody that has put Will Ferrell at the top yet.
No, probably not. No,
that's one that hasn't. Anybody else with a question in the question and answer window, please, or in the chat. And Nico
likes the Will Ferrell movie, she says. Okay. There's one fan of that movie.
Yeah, I've got two series that I haven't yet dipped into. I do love Elementary, by the way.
I do too.
Yeah, and sometimes when people,
I think Watson is fascinating in Johnny's series. I really, really like the way she does it.
Yeah, and Lee Child is a lovely chap who's helped us out with a few bits and pieces, and he wrote a foreword for one of our MX books in which he talks about being at Granada Studios when Brett was there. So he was actually working at Granada, which is really fascinating background. And his character, Jack Reacher, shares a lot of the characteristics with his deductive techniques there as well. When people ask me the question, who is my favorite Holmes, I sometimes be a bit cheeky and say House. And there's a lot of parallels there. He's got his own version of Watson. He's got his own version of the addiction to Vicodin and all those sorts of things as well.
Yes. Yes, I think it's probably fair to say that almost every modern detective has a touch of Sherlock in them, that either consciously or unconsciously, that the writers have brought some of the things from Sherlock Holmes into. Even, you look at somebody like Miss Marple, there's still touches of Sherlock in her thinking patterns. And I think that we're always going to be indebted. Anyone who writes a detective story of any kind is always going to be indebted to Sherlock.
Yeah, and Conan Doyle's often referred to as the father of all modern crime fiction. So you can trace it all back to Doyle. I'll leave it with you to give us a final thought for the day, Dorothy, before we wrap up. What would you like to share with the audience? What would you like to leave them with?
I guess I'd like to go back to that moment when I was 9, when I became a Sherlock Holmes fan. And I had just finished Sherlock Holmes and Nancy Drew, and I was lamenting the fact that there would never be anything better in the world, that they were the best books in the world. And my grandmother handed me Hound of the Baskervilles. And at some point, as I started reading every Sherlock story, I came to the part where Holmes asks Watson how many steps there are up front of their flat at Baker Street, and Watson, of course, hasn't a clue, because like most abled people, he doesn't have to count steps. And Sherlock tells him, well, there are 17 steps. And I know that because I both look and observe. I see it. And at that moment, it validated my life, because as a disabled child who was, in fact, that summer in casts and unable to swim when I first read Hound of the Baskervilles, as a disabled child, I counted every step. Holmes was the first adult I encountered who counted steps. So at that moment, he became my detective. And I think every person who finds a literary character that speaks directly to their heart is incredibly lucky. And that is one of the things that keeps the world of Sherlock alive and vital, even as many years later as it has been. So I encourage everybody to find their own Sherlock and get to know them and find the line in the work that speaks to them.
That's absolutely fantastic. And just remains for me to thank you for a wonderful reading and an even better Q&A. Lovely to talk to you, and looking forward to lots more books from you in the future.
Thank you very much to everybody at MX and everyone who attended. It was lovely. I appreciate it.
Fantastic. Good evening.
Bye-bye.